Welcome to the Pure Passion Podcast with Dr. David Kyle Foster. This podcast and our many other resources are made possible by our donors. Please support this ministry by going to our website, masteringlife.org.
Welcome to Pure Passion. I'm David Kyle Foster, your host. Today we have a special guest, Dr. Julie Hamilton. And it's good to see you, Julie. I went to your Homosexuality 101 conference many years ago, and I was so impressed with your knowledge and understanding of the causes of homosexuality and how people should be treated if they come for help. What is your ministry name? And
well, I'm just a private practitioner. I'm a marriage and family therapist. And so I have a private practice where I see a wide variety of clients, but then I also educate on the issue of gender identity and homosexuality, same-sex attractions. I was involved a while back with a research organization, formerly known as NARTH, but looking at the research behind the issue. And so I got very interested in educating people and helping people to understand how same-sex attractions develop in childhood and things like that.
Yeah, we had Dr. Joseph Nicolosi on our third video, our documentary film called Transformed. He's passed away since, but boy, he was really good at what he had discovered in terms of helping people with this issue.
Yes, he was brilliant. And he really made known so much information that people just don't generally understand. And so I got a passion for wanting to educate people when I, met him many years ago and learned all the information that he had.
Well, we want to talk today about what is the biblical view of gender and gender identity. Let's start there. What does the Bible say about it in truth versus what the media is trying to get us to believe?
Yes. Well, gender is important. And in our culture, we hear just so much about gender doesn't matter. And you can be whatever you want to be, boy or girl, it doesn't matter. But, it is important. And we actually see in the creation account, the description of where God created humans. In that section of scripture, Genesis 1:27, there are only two things that are mentioned about the creation of humans: that we were made in God's image and that we were made male and female. There were two options. In our culture, there's so many different options of what gender a person can be. But the truth is, God designed male and female, and he designed the two for a purpose. It's an amazing purpose, God's design. And just one other thing about that, male and female, we're different, but we're equal in value. So men and women are equal in value. We're made in God's image. We're different in function and in the roles that we have in life.
So, and then it says in the same passage in Genesis that God called them to be fruitful and multiply so that the two could become one flesh. Now that points to heterosexuality, doesn't it?
Yes. God's design is for a man and a woman to come together in marriage and through their union to produce life. It's so incredible and so amazing. And that is the intent, and that is the design. The other thing about marriage is that the Bible talks about how marriage symbolizes the union of Christ and the church, the bride and the groom. And so it's also a very sacred symbol. Not only is it life producing, and it's the context where children are born, and then it's also symbolic of the relationship that we can have with God through Jesus. And so it's very powerful, the importance of marriage and the purpose and the function of marriage.
Yeah, and besides Genesis 1, we have 1 Corinthians 6:9, is it 9 through 11, where it speaks of homosexuality, that people used to be homosexual. Such were some of you, it says. So there is a healing process for those who grow up with same-sex attractions, that God has a way to reverse and to heal and to deliver them from whatever it is that was the roots of those issues.
Yes, yes. And I always tell people the Bible does speak about homosexuality, and the Bible does speak about change being possible. I always want to clarify that having same-sex attractions is never in the Bible called a sin. It's
Right.
acting on those attractions. And
Exactly.
you mentioned there are some people have attractions for a number of different reasons. It's not typically people don't choose their attractions, but they also weren't born that way. There are things that happen in a child's life that lead to same-sex attraction. And yes, change is possible. Change of behavior as well as attraction to varying degrees. I always say that change is in this area is like change in any other area. Some
Yeah.
people who experience depression might go on to get help, and maybe their depression reduces a tremendous amount. And for other people, they may still have feelings of depression, but they develop tools and they learn how to live their lives beyond those feelings. And so it's the same with this issue. Change occurs to a variety of degrees.
So what are some of those childhood risk factors that may cause somebody to develop same-sex attractions?
Yes, there is so much that goes on in development, and so it's very complex. So I can share some of the primary root causes or the risk factors, but keeping in mind that it's complex and it's a number of things that usually go together to lead to same-sex attraction. But some of the things would be the bond it's important for children to have same-sex bonding very early on. So first bond is with the parents, and primarily when we're talking about gender identity, the bond with the same-sex parent kind of lays the foundation for gender identity development. So in the beginning, all babies bond with their mother first.
Yeah.
Then around the ages of 1.5 to 4, the bond with the same-sex parent is really important. So the child bonds first, all babies bond first with their mother. That's the first attachment figure. And then a little boy will go on to need to identify with the father, and a little girl will continue to stay bonded and connected to the mother as the source of gender identification. Both parents are important to boys and girls, but for gender identification, same-sex bonding is very important, especially between 1.5 and 4, and then it continues to be important later. The other ingredient would be peer bonding. So usually between the ages of 5 and puberty, 10, 11, 12, during those years, it's very important for children to have same-sex peer bonding. So little boys need other boys to play with and identify with. Little girls need other girls to play with, to be accepted, to be included, to be connected with members of the same sex in the peer group. And that contributes to their understanding of themselves.
Yeah.
So we first attach to members of the same sex to understand who we are before we can be attracted to the opposite sex.
Yeah, I liken it to a seed. Our sexuality is in seed form when we're born. It's like a dormant seed in the ground, but that seed needs to be given the nutrients and the water through the early years so that when puberty hits, it germinates into a healthy manner. And so the homosexual attractions have to do with that seed not getting what it needs in order to germinate in a healthy fashion.
That's a good analogy. I think that's a very good way to put it. Yes.
So the girl is already identified with the feminine, but if the mother hasn't bonded with her mother, and so she's incapable of providing that bonding experience with her daughter, and that could be one of the factors that might create a lesbian neurosis.
Yes. And, I always want to clarify too, I know a lot of parents, blame themselves for things that go wrong in childhood. And the truth is most parents do the best that they can do with the tools that they have.
Yeah.
And like you said, sometimes you don't always have the tools. Maybe you didn't get the needs met in your own life, as a parent growing up as a child. And so it is important to recognize that there is no perfect parent. We all are humans and parents fall short and we do the best that we can. But sometimes needs do go unmet. And a lot of times parents don't realize that needs are going unmet. That's one of the reasons why I'm really excited these days about talking to parents of young children about prevention, because parents often just don't know about the needs that their children have emotionally, and especially when it comes to this area of gender identity, but just in general. And so it's nice if we can get to parents when they're starting out and educate them on some of these things. But yes, as you were saying, sometimes the bond just isn't there. And so in some cases, other members of that family can even fill in the gap. Sometimes a girl might bond with an aunt or a grandmother or other, females in her life. But when there is a lack of same-sex bonding, when it really is a deficit for that child, and then add to it, if the child has no same-sex peer bonding happening, that can leave a craving for, let's say if it's a girl, it can leave a craving for feminine love or feminine connection, which later in puberty can go on to be a sexual craving or romantic desire to be with the same sex.
I remember in my years in Hollywood, when I was living the gay lifestyle, the women, they seem to be either butch, is what we would call them, sort of embracing the masculine, or super feminine, femmes, we would call them. What creates the difference in the direction a young girl would go, like a direction such as that?
Yes, some girls would have maybe they navigated through that early stage of the mother bonding. So the early infancy and then 1.5 to 4, they may have had the connection with the mom. And so the femininity begins to develop in them, but there may be something later that happens. And this is a theory that later they could have, certainly another thing that we haven't talked about yet, but sexual abuse can also create confusion in a child's life. And so there could be later wounding. Maybe they navigate that early stage well, the groundwork is laid for the femininity to develop, but the wounding occurs later. It could be in peer bonding deficit, there could be bullying, there could be pornography exposure, sexual abuse, or even, breakdowns within the family. But things that occur later, so that then creates a void that becomes a sexual desire for women. One other thing I will add is, especially right now, probably when you were in Hollywood, as you mentioned, but even more so now, it's very trendy for girls to experiment and claim an LGBT, a lesbian or even transgender identity. And so some of these girls that are feminine and, not what you would think, that are claiming a gay identity might be experimenting, or they tried experimenting and then kind of continue to embrace that identity. So that's another factor. That's not for everyone. That doesn't apply to everyone, but that for some girls, especially the teenagers that I see now, the ones that are claiming a transgender identity that really had no history of that type of thinking, and even the ones that end up in same-sex relationships, some of the ones I'm seeing, it's more culturally induced. In other words, it's trendy, it's an identity that they want to claim because of how popular that is for some of the girls. Again, not all, but I'm seeing that a little bit here now.
Yeah, all of the factors we're talking about would apply only in some homosexuals, not all of them. There's really a convergence of a multiplicity of factors, isn't there? Yeah. That is different with each homosexual. And those meet the personality, the experiences, and it's that combination that can create what we're talking about.
Yes, exactly.
Now, these girls that you just described, they may have a lack of affirmation. I remember reading material from Dr. Conrad Bars, and his specialty was what a lack of affirmation creates in someone in terms of a need to be affirmed. And so these girls who are pretending or imagining that they're homosexual or transgender, these days they're affirmed big time. In fact, they're almost a step above everybody else in some social settings. So maybe it's a seeking out of affirmation that they never got in childhood.
Yes, I think that makes perfect sense as one of the ingredients that
Yeah.
go into it. Affirmation is so important, and really, God designed us. He created us in His image. We have great value and worth, but unless a child is taught that, they don't always know that. So children need to be told that they matter, that they're special, that they're loved. God designed us to need love and a sense of belonging and connection, and sometimes those needs don't get met in right ways, and it does leave a void. So
Yeah.
yes, that's very important what you're saying.
Yeah. I remember the first time I had a homosexual experience. It was a man who picked me up, and he looked at me and he said, "You're beautiful."
Mm.
And I was like this dry sponge of lack of affirmation.
Mhm.
And when I heard that affirmation from the man, of course, he was manipulating me, but some affirmations are better than none. Sometimes you choose the negative because it's better than what you haven't had, the void that you have. So somebody who hasn't been affirmed, I mean, they're a sitting duck sometimes for somebody who comes along and affirms them in order to manipulate them.
Yeah.
And that can go back, of course, to the family system where they were never affirmed. And so they had this starving drive in them.
Yes, yes. Your story reminds me of the verse in Proverbs that says, "To a man who is full, even honey is loathsome, but to a man who is starving, that which is bitter tastes sweet."
Yes.
So yeah, that if you're hungry for love, you'll take love however you can get it. Or if you're hungry for affirmation or hungry to know that you have an identity or a purpose or value or meaning, if that hasn't been met, then getting it however you can get it is often what happens.
And then as you continue seeking out those relationships to get the affirmation, and you keep getting the reinforcement of the pleasure that you're experiencing, you're sort of programming yourself into same-sex attractions that are more intense, aren't you?
You're reinforcing, yes, because sexual appetites can be reinforced through behavior, and so that, yes, it's reinforcing something, and yes, and that's what happens. You see, and I know people personally who thought they would experiment, but then the experimentation becomes a lifetime, many years, because sexual involvement and attention and love, what like just what we said, whether it's love in a good way or love in a bad way, can feel good, and then it can kind of hook you into wanting more and more, and it can become what started out as maybe just experimenting can become a lifetime.
Yeah. So we've been talking about the women, and we've been talking about how a lack of affirmation and bonding, emotional bonding with same sex can be factors. I have found those to be secondary to childhood sexual abuse. However, I'm sure you found that as well. In fact, most of the female homosexuals that I've encountered or ministered to were sexual abuse victims. That seems to be the dominant factor. Although some women who are sexually abused, most women who are sexually abused don't develop this. But if you have cofactors and you're sexually abused, you can develop a hatred or a fear of men, can't you?
Yes. Sexual abuse is a common factor for a lot of people. And like you said, not everyone who's sexually abused will end up with same-sex attraction, but many people who have same-sex attraction have had a history of sexual abuse. But I always say not everyone. And for some, it's simply these bonding needs, the developmental needs that are the key factors for them. There are many people who have same-sex attractions that were never sexually abused. But for those who are sexually abused, it can set in motion great confusion and can definitely derail a person. For men, males or females, boys or girls who are sexually abused, it can create appetites, it can create aversions, it can definitely affect a child in so many different ways. So it is very, very traumatic for children that are sexually abused.
And I suppose being bullied by your same-sex peers must be a factor in many cases.
Yes. And so if you think about the vulnerability of childhood, children are trying to figure out if they matter, if they're developing a sense of who they are. And when they are ridiculed or ostracized or picked on from their peer group, it can lead to such wrong thoughts and ideas about self, so boys that are picked on or bullied by other boys can begin to think they aren't manly enough, or they're not masculine enough, or they don't have what it takes to be a part of the male world. Same thing with girls that are picked on and bullied. Children need connection, acceptance, inclusion. They need to know that they belong and that they're a part of the group. And when they feel outside, when they are outside the group, they will begin to feel inferior. They can start to feel something's wrong with me. I'm different. I don't have what it takes. I don't measure up to the others. And so it can lead to a feeling of an inadequacy, even in their gender. So a little boy might think, I'm not masculine enough. I don't have what it takes. A little girl can feel that as well. And then the other thing that's happening is they need same-sex bonding in those early years, the elementary school years. They need same-sex bonding in order to understand themselves and have a strong sense of who they are.
Yeah.
So not only is the bullying detrimental because it makes them feel inadequate, but it's also creating this void of the need. So the need for same-sex love and connection isn't happening, isn't being met for them. And that can later become a craving for same-sex connection in a more sexual way after puberty, or during, as puberty as they're entering into puberty. So bullying, being left out, being picked on, and even just the lack of same-sex connection and adequate same-sex connection can leave a person with cravings that later become sexualized.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, because when I was bullied, I began staring at other guys, and I didn't know why. I thought I was going crazy. Why? What? And it wasn't sexual at all initially. It's my contention that same-sex attraction initially is an emotional disorder that becomes sexualized when puberty hits, or prematurely with pornography or sexual abuse. Would you agree with that?
And emotional craving, I think it starts out not even as a disorder, but just an emotional craving that isn't met. I totally agree with you. It's not a sexual thing to begin with. It's an emotional, there are deficits in development. And again, not to blame parents. The other thing that's really important here is perceptions are key. And perceptions are linked with temperament. So I know parents who are wonderful, loving parents, but maybe they have a sensitive child who doesn't receive the love or perceive the love. Yes. And so that child, especially if they have that naturally sensitive temperament, which can be a gift. Sensitive people are usually compassionate for others. They have the ability for empathy, but sensitivity can also cause them to perceive rejection when rejection isn't meant. They can get wounded more easily, hurt more easily. So sometimes you see the sensitive child and the loving parent, but the things that the love isn't being absorbed by the child, or the child is feeling rejected when the parent isn't really trying to be rejecting. And so it's that temperament and the sensitivity that causes often misinterpretation, or taking things in a way that isn't really meant, or isn't even happening. And that's a big factor. And that's why it's important for parents. It's important for parents to know that, so that they realize it's not just what's going on the parent's end, but how the child is perceiving it and receiving it.
Yeah. I remember, living with this sense of rejection. And then, the gay community comes along and they're totally accepting and, just affirming you because they think you're gay and they want to affirm you in that. And so you've got this one crowd, the heterosexual males who are rejecting you. And then you have the gay crowd who's totally affirming and accepting you. And it's intoxicating. It's hard to resist.
Yes, absolutely. And I think a lot of people just feel right at home when they first decide to enter into a gay relationship or into the LGBT world, because of that acceptance that you're talking about, that acceptance and connection and the bonding that they missed out on, that they've been craving for so long. And so at first it's like, oh my goodness, this is what I've been wanting all my life. But the real needs, the deep emotional needs, aren't really met through same-sex sexual relationships. They're met in non-sexual ways, because the real needs are emotional.
Yeah.
And so it feels good at first, but it doesn't really meet the deeper need and really the deeper needs that really only God can fill at that point. When we have voids from childhood, God can fill those needs, but finding love in wrong ways doesn't take away those voids from childhood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit. We talked a lot about the females. The male seems to be flipped. With the females, it seems to be sexual abuse and lack of bonding in order. With the males, it's lack of bonding and sexual abuse. I find both factors in most male homosexuals.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes, and I don't know the statistics on that, so I can't speak about, definitively about what the statistics are. But you can see, I do know people and have seen that where both are there. But I've also seen males where there's not sexual abuse; it's really just the bonding, and I've seen some where it really was the sensitivity and the perception. Like I said, I know when we speak about both males and females, I can think of people that I've known and families where they really where they had loving families, but there was a breakdown between the love being given and the love being received. So, but probably more than more often I have seen the ones where there is, the deficit, and then the sexual abuse is also a factor. So
yeah,
yes.
and the perception. I remember when I was 7, 6, 7, we had this lady in our family environment who looked like Marilyn Monroe.
Mm-hmm.
And this is when Marilyn Monroe was the goddess of the film world. I mean, everybody thought she was beautiful, and the males all lusted after her. And so this woman in our family environment would come over to the house a lot, and she would tease me about whether I had a girlfriend and whether I liked her. And I was just this like 5 or 6 year old boy, and it humiliated me to be teased in this way about girls. I didn't have a girlfriend.
Yes.
So it was like a sense of, oh, you're not normal because you should be having a girlfriend, and so forth and so on. So my perception growing up from that was females were going to humiliate me. And it engendered in me a fear of women. So going with the men just seemed easier because there wasn't the rejection that I perceived I would get with the women. So this is an example of factors that you would never have guessed would have been causal in this area. And yet with a sensitive child, as you said, it can create this whole world of self-doubt and aberration.
Yes, that's a good example, really, because in that situation, parents may not have any clue that that's going on in a child's mind.
Exactly.
It was a feeling for you, is a feeling of probably inadequacy and humiliation, embarrassment, but it was no one outside, your parents probably didn't know what was going on inside your mind about that, yet it really was a very important factor for you. And so, that's one of the things I do try to talk with parents about, is really trying to tune in and be connected as much as possible to the reactions of children, and because we don't always know what's going on in their mind. And so it does take some real tuning in and of course praying for wisdom and discernment as well.
And they shouldn't feel guilty if they don't perceive something that elusive or something you would never expect.
Exactly.
And this is what I had to come to terms with my parents, that I was blaming them for so much that, they shouldn't have been blamed for, because they didn't know what was going on in my mind and my heart. So there was no way for them to counter it with anything.
That's right. Yes. That's a good point. I'm glad that you mentioned that for the person, the child growing up where needs aren't met, the importance of forgiving and releasing parents from that, feeling of debt, that the parents did them wrong or something, that being able to release the parents and realize that most parents do the best that they can do with what they have and with the information that they have as well. Yeah.
Yeah, another factor with me was I never bonded with my father. He was kind of like a cold, severe, distant kind of figure in my life. And of course, I blamed him for not loving me. But later on during my healing process, the Lord showed me that he didn't have that to give to me because his father was the same way. So he never received the security in his masculinity that he could pass on to me.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so good that God has revealed these things to you over the years that you could release him. But that's exactly what does happen, that parents don't always have it to give because they weren't given it themselves.
So let's talk about, let's say parents are listening and they're very worried. Am I doing this to my child? And I know how parents can be, that, they can just fill themselves with all kinds of guilt that they shouldn't be filling themselves with.
Yes.
But let's say you have a mother who didn't emotionally bond with her mother. She's not connected to the feminine, or you have a father, the same sort of situation with the masculine. What would you recommend to those parents to do to help reverse perhaps what has come of that with their child?
Yes, yes. And so depending on the age of the child, if they have children that are still young, then I would encourage parents, as they learn about what some of the needs are and they discover that maybe they didn't meet those needs, I would encourage them that it's not too late to begin trying to pour into their child. And for Christian parents, as Christians, we have the power of the Holy Spirit to equip us to do what we cannot do. So I encourage parents to pray that God will fill them with his love and the ability to be whatever it is that doesn't come natural. So for some parents, they may not naturally be verbally affirming or physically affectionate or nurturing in those ways. And so really seeking God's equipping to love their children in a way that their children can receive, to find what is important, whether it is whatever's been missing, to fill in those gaps, that it is not too late. If it's an adult child and a parent realizes looking back that they missed some things or didn't meet the needs, I encourage parents to be able to recognize that and even confess that.
Yeah, and apologize. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And what's important here is there's guilt and there's shame. Guilt can be productive. If we see that we've done something wrong and we recognize that and ask God to forgive us, he forgives us, and he can bring good out of our mistakes. And so we can seek forgiveness of God and seek forgiveness of the other person. Shame is something that is not as productive as healthy guilt. And that's when we see that we've done something wrong and we feel like we are that wrong thing and we are, completely worthless.
Yes.
And so being able to recognize we are made in God's image, we have great value and worth, and we will make mistakes. We do make mistakes, but we can have forgiveness and there could be redemption even of our mistakes. When we realize that and that our mistakes don't define us, that's when we can have a healthy sense of, oh my goodness, I really messed up. Let me confess this. Let me make it right. Let me go and do things differently going forward.
Yeah, someone who's living with a river of self-hatred in them, when they do something wrong, their thought is, I did a wrong thing. Their thought is not, I did a wrong thing. Their thought is, I am the wrong thing.
Yes.
I'm defective. I'm incapable of being loved and all of that. Yes.
Yes. And that's where it's so important to really hone in on who we are in Christ. And I encourage, for all of us, whether a person's full of self-hatred or not, really, but especially if you're full of self-hatred, growing in that intimacy with God. So being in the scriptures, praying, being in prayer, focusing in on who God is and who he's made us to be, and allowing him. I tell people, pray that God will help you see him for who he is and see you eyes. Pray that God will help you see yourself through his eyes. Allow him to transform the view that we have of ourselves. Yeah. And that comes over time as we pursue that deep intimacy and closeness with him.
Yeah. Well, sadly, we're out of time. So I just want to assure you, we're going to continue this conversation in part 2. So we're talking to Dr. Julie Hamilton. She's a family therapist. Would you call yourself a family therapist?
Yes.
In Florida, and one sharp cookie as far as I'm concerned about what brings a brokenness in a person's life, and then what what can bring healing to that brokenness. So make sure you tune in next week, because we're going to have Julie back and we're going to continue this discussion. God bless you. I'm David Kyle Foster for Pure Passion.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Remember, much of Dr. Foster's teaching has been taken from his new book entitled Sexual Healing Reference Edition, available at our website, masteringlife.org. This podcast and our many other resources are available because of our donors. If you are one of them, thank you. If you would like to join in supporting us, please visit masteringlife.org.